Hello, and welcome to this Center for Brooklyn History talk. I'm Marcia Eli from the Brooklyn Public Library, the Center for Brooklyn History, and the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Tonight's program looks at Muslim representation in media and culture, the stereotypes, as well as the authentic diversity, and explores the impact these representations have on anti-Muslim attitudes and anti-Muslim racism. The program is inspired by the new book titled Broken: The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion by Evelyn Alsultany, who is a leading expert on the topic. You can explore the book by going to the link in the chat. And also in that link, if you would like, you can purchase it from an independent bookstore. So we have a really impressive panel of creative people and experts, writers, directors, to share their perspectives and insights on this topic. Quickly, before I introduce all of them, I want to make sure you know that the option for closed captioning is available to you. That is a button at the bottom of your screen. And I also want to invite you to share your questions this evening. Type them throughout the program into the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. So with that, it is truly my enormous honor and pleasure to welcome our guests by telling you a little bit about each of them and inviting them to join me here on camera. I'll start with Iman. Iman Ahmed is an Egyptian-American TV writer and playwright. Her play, Banned, about the Muslim travel ban, premiered off-Broadway in 2021. Evelyn Alsultany, whose book Broken I mentioned earlier, is an associate professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, LA. She has deep experience serving as a consultant for Hollywood studios on how to better represent Muslim characters. Malik Aziz is a writer and director whose work has been featured, among other places, on BET's Lens on Talent. He won the Best Screenplay Award for his feature Midnight in Kansas at the Urban World Film Festival and was chosen for the 2022 Muslim list hosted by the Blacklist. Iram Parveen Bilal is a Pakistani-American filmmaker, activist, and entrepreneur raised in Nigeria and Pakistan. Her feature film, I'll Meet You There, debuted at South by Southwest in 2020 in the narrative competition. And she just wrapped principal photography in Pakistan on her latest feature, Wakiri, which I hope I pronounced correctly, which means one of a kind, just last month. And finally, our moderator tonight is Lorraine Ali. Lorraine is the television critic of the Los Angeles Times. Previously, she was a senior writer covering culture at large, entertainment, and American Muslim issues. She is an award-winning journalist and LA native, and she has written in publications ranging from the New York Times to Rolling Stone to GQ. So I want to thank you all so much for joining in this conversation. I really can't wait to hear what you say, and I will be listening carefully, as I know will everybody else. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marcia, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to say to all of you panelists before we start, thank you for all the different projects that you have done in terms of Muslim representation and bringing authentic stories public, because we don't often see them. And that is what we're here to talk about today. First, I think I would like to just throw out a question, and it's going to seem pretty broad, Evelyn. So, feel free to squish this down as much as you can. But who and what has driven the narratives generally that we have seen in the media And I'm talking like either news or in terms of film or television, like who has had control of that narrative, and how did we get here?
Thanks, Lorraine. Before I start, I want to thank Marcia and the Center for Brooklyn History for organizing this. And it's really such an honor to be on this panel with my panelists, Malik Aziz, Iram Parveen Bilal, and Iman Ahmed. So thank you so much. So how did we get here? Well, if we look at Hollywood, I mean, there are many ways that we got here, but if, for my research is about Hollywood, we're dealing with a 100-year history of stereotyping Muslims. And this stereotyping has involved conflating Arab and Muslim identities, and then projecting Arab Muslims as terrorists, rich oil sheiks, belly dancers, harem girls, oppressed veiled women. And my research over the last 20 years has been trying to track certain changes that have taken place that are positive. But one of the premises of my work is that a positive representation on the surface might seem good, but might be collaborating in storylines that justify exclusion. So I would love to just take the opportunity to outline 3 moments of change since 9/11. One is the appearance of the quote unquote good Muslims. So after 9/11, we had more terrorists, more projections of Muslims as a threat to national security. And then we start seeing this character, the quote unquote good Muslim, who's an FBI agent, a CIA agent, and we start seeing them in a lot of TV shows like Homeland, 24, Quantico. And again, on the surface, it seems good. It's a sympathetic character, it's a likable character, but it's still in the context of terrorism. And in my book, Broken, I refer to this as stereotype confined expansions, where you have a stereotype and then you're responding to it. Oh, we have a terrorist, let's challenge it by having a patriot. Or, oh, we have this religious fanatic and we're gonna counter it by having a secular Muslim. So around the 2010s, we start seeing secular Muslims like Aziz Ansari, Kumail Nanjiani, Shahs of Sunset is another example. And I'm not criticizing them, but rather that is what became possible at that moment. Secular Muslims in response to the terrorist Muslim. And then the third moment I would want to highlight is the Muslim ban, which Donald Trump expressed for the first time in 2015, while on the campaign trail before he became president. And it inspired unprecedented change. It inspired Hollywood, many other institutions to react. They were outraged. And since then, we have seen more diverse portrayals of Muslims than ever before. We're seeing more Black Muslims, more queer Muslims, more South Asian Muslims. I have a list of shows like Ms. Marvel, Rami, Mo, We Are Lady Parts, sort of. LL Cool J came out as Muslim on NCIS, Comment on the Show. I mean, I have this very, very long list. And so we're finally seeing not confined to terrorism, not confined to the stereotype, but very much, and I don't know where it's going if we need another crisis to respond to, because this was very much in response to Trump-esque crisis.
Right. And oh, We Are Lady Parts is so fantastic. Whoever has not watched that, it's so fantastic. I want to open this up to the rest of you, and please feel free to just, chime in if you have any other ideas on this. But as Muslims, either growing up in America, American Muslims, how did what you saw on screen or stage or didn't see influence you to become a creator in your respective fields? And I'm just going to throw that out to whoever wants to answer that first. Oh, am I going to have to call on you guys? Thank you, Malik.
For me, the very easy answer is not seeing myself very directly influenced me to choose this career path, choose this path altogether. I referenced it in It's a Great Film, Malcolm X by Spike Lee, but that was 92, that was 31 years ago. And some great examples have been named, but overall, it's still not where it needs to be. And so even for me, and I would say specifically as an African-American, even seeing that change from where we started, so I go back to the original question, the broad answer of what happens when who's defining Muslims? It's been non-Muslims. And in the same way, for me as a Black person who's defined Black popular culture, not musically, music's been very good, but in terms of film and television, it's been non-Black people for so long that now that there's been so many, it will never be perfect, but now that we have much more to choose from, you see the diversity of us, it makes it so that easy is the wrong word, and I know we have a lot to talk about in terms of that, but it does make it for people who do not grow up around us to say, okay, look, every Black person is not a gangster the same way every Muslim is not a terrorist. And I'll stop there. I know other people have responses, but I'll start the conversation with that.
I was going to say that, you know, for me, it was a step before that. I landed in the US a year before 9/11, exactly almost a year and 5 days before. And for me, as somebody being Pakistani, misrepresentation is another level. You know, it's like you internationally, for the most part, are lumped with India. And then you come here and then you're like, oh, I want to have some representation for Pakistan. And then this 9/11 happened. And then there was all of that, you know, and I promptly left engineering and moved into film, primarily because I was like, we have a lot of doctors, lawyers, and engineers. We don't have filmmakers, you know. And I definitely feel that in the last 15 years, the urgency of storytelling, in fact, even hijacking the word storytelling by other professions, has come to the forefront because of that realization that it is an imminent need for survival and to stay forward. So for me, I would say, yes, it was a very direct reaction to, one had to take a mantle because you just didn't see it around. And then I was also obsessed with Bollywood on the side. So that was it.
For me, I would say I grew up around the time of animated Aladdin, like the mid-90s. And so people would, because I was like the only Egyptian person people knew, the only Muslim person people knew, they would call me an Egyptian princess. Like I had the relation to Jasmine, and it was very positive and exotic, of course. But then I, of course, felt that shift at 9/11, where I lost all that positivity and it became very negative and people look at you with suspicion. And just seeing the stories that came out of that and feeling the inauthentic, like how it didn't connect with me, it didn't feel real. I think that was a big drive to be a creator, to see things that connected to my daily life, the people that I had around me. I never saw them on TV, and I just wanted to show that to people who don't have Muslim people in their life. You know, we are a minority in America, and it's very dangerous when the only Muslim that people see commits violence or murder. It affects how they see us and how they treat us.
Yeah, and you know, in my field in journalism, I think, you know, particularly around 9/11 and the Iraq War, I was hearing people in the newsroom talking about the Iraqis, they're tribal people. How are they going to react when, you know, as though they were one monolithic thing, you know, how are they going to react when we go in? So I think I was driven to start, you know, moving out of just writing about entertainment or just writing about culture to specifically tackling Muslim racism against Muslims, Islamophobia, all of that, to set the record straight, to have some representation on that side of the media. And one thing, Malik, when you were talking, I just remember this around 9/11, and Evelyn, you can probably speak to this too, but I remember seeing in the news, you know, there's a ton of fear about Muslims, but all of a sudden the Muslims that were familiar were American Black Muslims. And they became almost like the spokespeople for Islam in America at that moment that didn't scare the rest of America. Do you agree with that? Because I thought that was such an interesting turn.
Yeah, I will say, tragically, ironically, 9/11, I'm sure didn't affect me in the same way that it affected a lot of other Muslims. It affected me when I went to the airport. Don't get me wrong, you know, they see my name, they're like, you know, get in line. But yeah, it's funny you say that. That might have been one of the first times where, to your point, people are like, wait, you're a Muslim? What's going on? Tell me about like your people, your culture. And it was, you know, I'm willing to help. But again, to your point, I'm one guy, and the kind of Muslim I am is probably not what you are thinking of. So it was a weird time in that sense, definitely.
And Evelyn, I mean, there's so much to tackle here, but like just in terms of, you touched on it in what you were opening up with, but 9/11 and how moving forward that really kind of was like a seismic shift in the types of representation that we were seeing on screens. So like if you can just jump in there where you want.
Yeah, and it was interesting because there was a shift, but it was so limiting. So the patriotic Muslim is better, but it doesn't take us anywhere. We're still confined to the stereotype. And and just to be clear, I am not saying that today we've reached the promised land, but that after Trump, we are seeing more diverse representations of Muslims than we've ever seen before. I'm very skeptical of it because we tend to respond to crisis. And I thought, what was it about this moment with Trump that inspired so much outrage, that galvanized people to action? If Obama had been president, I don't think we would have had this shift that took place around representations of Muslims. So there was something about him that galvanized people to change. So we have Muslim ban, Hollywood is like, we're going to do something about this. We're going to expand representations. The problem in Hollywood is 100 years of stereotypes, but it's the Muslim ban, a policy that they are responding to. So when I watch all of that play out, I'm happy that there's an opening. I've never seen the representations that are available today. I wish they were available when I was growing up. But I feel skeptical that A, we're responding to crisis, and when there's no crisis, it's like everything's fine. So I don't know if this will continue. And B, in Hollywood, the crisis, they made the crisis. We're talking 100 years of stereotyping. So I would like to see Hollywood really work on that and its impact in all communities, not just Muslims. We've had this, white, male, cisgendered, heteronormative person at the center of value, and it's impacted all other communities. And there's just so much work to do to get other people's stories, which is why I'm so happy about the work that our panelists are doing to bring such needed stories to the public.
I wanted to piggyback on that because I do agree, as somebody working on like the female directing sort of activism space, there is such a temporary shift sometimes. I mean, USC Annenberg brings these reports out every year, and I was just reading how 2020 was like the monumental year for female directors, and then the pandemic hit, and of course all the isms. Whenever there's natural shifts, if you're not really tackling the source of the problem, those isms are going to reset, and all those marginalized are going to be re-marginalized, right? So it is interesting to see. I remember that, before the Muslim ban, and my film also, I'll Meet You There, was a direct reaction to, financing for that came together through crowdfunding after the Muslim ban. And, it was impossible to fund before. And I do realize before Trump, there would be arguments about Islamophobia. Does it really exist? At least that was put to rest after Trump, where everybody united that yes, it exists, because there was a loud piece, loud mouth or loudspeaker saying it. So
loud mouthpiece.
Loud mouthpiece. I wanted to just put forward something I was just reading in prep for this panel, a Pew Research Center study that just said that though many Americans have negative images or like views about Muslims, 53% only say that, or 53% say that don't personally know any Muslims in their lives, which is pretty significant, right? So I think that, yes, I agree with you on the stereotyping, but the facet really still remains that even if we're making these Muslim representation stories, who is watching them? And I think one of the big piece is sort of distribution and marketing, and the idea, it's a double-edged sword where we watch who we are, and how do we normalize watching everyone's stories? How we grew up watching Caucasian stories. We can make all the Muslim stories we want, but if only Muslims are watching them, how far are we getting? So there's some sort of disconnect there, I think, which could also maybe address a proper representation / education / familiarity and awareness, which can help.
And that seems like I'm sorry if anybody was just going to talk, cut me off, feel free. there's so many interesting points in here I want to tackle, but you just mentioned tackling the source of the problem. And sometimes it feels like that there is progress, but then, okay, everything's fine and it slides back. What is tackling the source of the problem, right? Where does that start? I mean, I think this is, how do we get to the core?
Can I take like a completely different view? And I feel like instead of the top down from Hollywood, we need to look at like encouraging Muslim American teenagers and children to go into the arts and to not steer them towards, being doctors and lawyers, engineers, which are all wonderful, respectable professions, but not having that base of, Arab American, Muslim American actors, writers, directors. It starts there. It starts in these rooms to tell their stories for people to sell and, make the next big thing, the next Crazy Rich Asians, the next international story, because a good story is a good story, as we've seen, during the pandemic with Squid Games, a show in Korean, the whole world was watching it because it's a good story. So I think like encouraging creativity amongst like Muslim people, is another way to start.
And
I'm gonna
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. I
No,
was just
you
gonna say,
do.
for me, the source of the problem, I mean, you just can't untie media and politics.
Yep.
There's such and you being a journalist, there's such a driving force for what soft power and media does to generations of viewpoints, right? I mean, we can't ignore that. So where we are is not just a random, oh, okay. I mean, it's just so I guess encourage Muslims to be in politics in addition to the arts, I don't know.
I mean, that's the point. It's not one thing. It's on every level. When you're talking about anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, Hollywood plays a role. Hollywood doesn't create policies, but it influences public opinion. It influences perceptions. But then we have all these policies, whether it's Muslim ban or a 20-year war on terror, that's not only sending the message of Muslims as a threat to national security, but destroying people's lives. I think 150,000 Iraqi civilians were killed during the war, over 30,000 Afghan civilians. There are, real life consequences to these representations, even though Hollywood's not literally killing people. It's an influence. And I often cite Muniba Salim's research. She's a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and she did a study that shows that repeated exposure to either news stories or entertainment television of Muslims as terrorists there's a correlation to supporting war in Muslim majority country and to supporting a restriction in civil liberties for Muslims in the US. So the stories are so powerful. And when I hear someone say it's just entertainment, I lose it, because it's really not just entertainment. It impacts us personally. It impacts how we see people. It impacts policies. It impacts, people's lives.
Yeah, we could want to say that things have improved, when we look at Mo and Rami and stuff, but if you actually look at the statistics of Muslim immigration in this country, it has declined. So, again, like everything is not just a monolith, like what does improvement really mean? And I agree with you, Evelyn. I think it's diversity of representation. What is representation really? I am representing only my story, and there needs to be so many of us that actually ultimately the labels go away. But, it's a long way.
When we're talking about also who's watching these stories, right? I mean, that we're putting out there. I'm gonna take an egregious film that like made me want to scream in the theater, which was Wonder Woman. I did have to go to the theater because of my son and see it. I did not willingly just like sit and pay for a ticket to Wonder Woman for myself. I just want to say that. But the idea that like the Middle Eastern or whatever they were supposed to be, it was just so egregious. It was almost like a throwback to like 1984. But had there been Muslims in the room, it's not a Muslim story, it's not an Arab story, but had there been anybody in the room representing, that might not have happened. So it's not necessarily, I'm trying to make the point that it's not necessarily like the story is directly about us or our communities. It's just something that we correct when it completely is a misrepresentation. So that's one thing that I think just having the numbers in there, when I watch a film or, television series, I look at when those credits roll, I want to see who's behind the scenes, because it does make a difference in what you see.
I agree.
We'd hope
Okay.
so. Yeah.
And we talked about, you talked about historically, obviously, how Hollywood has influenced, when we say Hollywood, it's the media and all of it, but how it has influenced American opinion and, also global policy, things like that. Do you think there is that same kind of power of Hollywood and television moving forward, given that it's so fragmented now, given that, TV particularly is so much more niche, film doesn't really have the power that it had. And I want to include theater in here too, because I know we have playwrights. Does it have this, do you think moving forward it has the same power to move the needle either way?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because we are in an era where if I mention a TV show I'm watching, the chances are you're not watching it, or I haven't heard of what you're watching. And when 24 was out, everyone knew what it was. Everyone was watching it. Even Homeland was in an era where people knew what that was, and a lot of people were watching it. And now on the one hand, we have so many more options, and we have access to global television shows and movies. It complicates things to say, wow, we have Rami and We Are Lady Parts, but then most people haven't heard of them. So how powerful is that? And I agree with what Iram said earlier, that we need lots of stories. So the point is that if we've had this history of literally thousands of productions that have stereotyped Muslims, we need thousands of stories that are diverse. So hopefully at some point, you'll meet a Muslim on your screen who you will see as your friend. At some point, if there are, 5 productions are not going to erase, negate, challenge the history. It's so enormous. It's just not possible. And there's so much pressure on these shows also. Like Rami has to undo a century of stereotypes. And, so there's also just too much pressure right now.
Right, because there's been so little of it. It's like, okay, you have to do everything to correct all the wrong before it. I mean, Mo can't do that. Mo is Mo. So it's sort of like it's hard, because we know these are individual stories, but then they're up against decades and decades of misrepresentation. And please, again, feel free to cut me off if you want to say something. I wanted to ask, how do you think we reframe what inclusive media representation means? And this is out to all of you.
I talk a lot, so I'm not going to talk first.
I was trying to hold back too, to hear from Iman and Malik.
Honestly, I'm trying to understand the question.
Well, I mean, you kind of did touch on the idea of from the ground up, of more Muslims, young Muslims getting into, these areas of media, entertainment. And that changes, it definitely moves the needle. I mean, how are other ways like that we can sort of affect change in terms of more authentic representation? And I guess when I say reframe, it's like, clearly what was happening in the past wasn't working. How do we reframe it? How do we move it?
I mean, based on like what Dr. Alsultany had talked about, I think have more opportunities because there are streaming channels and we're not all watching the same 5 channels. There's more opportunities for people to tell different stories. Like we saw with We Are Lady Parts, where it's a Muslim rock band that, I don't know if that would ever happen if we only had network TV. So I am actually excited about the future, because I feel like more people have a chance if you have a good story and, if you have Muslim characters. I feel like we are moving the needle forward. I mean, we're not going to 100 miles an hour, but like we're moving forward. like all the progress that we're talking about has happened in the last 5 years. So I feel like, I mean, Rami, Mo, We Are Lady Parts, Marvel, this is the past 5 years. So like, I'm hoping the future is brighter and that we have more opportunities for Muslim storytellers.
And I would add to that just speaking from how Hollywood typically works, somebody has to be the one that just, there's like a Black Panther in the sense that there has to be a Muslim story that makes $1 billion. And then everybody's gonna come, hey, so what do you got? And that's just, you know, it's kind of cynical, but just the history of Hollywood. It's green doesn't always work, but green says a lot in terms of what the people have the power to put our shows on this streaming form or that streaming form. If it's making money, they'll come looking for us. So somebody has to be the one that just breaks through. That's my opinion.
I think, and I'm going to piggyback on what Iman was saying, top down to grassroots, I think that there needs to be inclusion on every level from green lighting to distribution. That is when we're really going to see change. Because even if you have one film that does really well, you know, the naysayers will always be like, oh, but that was just the one. And again, we see that with women's activism all the time. So I feel that reframing, and then also in terms of creation and content creation, what works really well with Miss Marvel is these are not stereotypes that we've seen. And, you know, I say this, my film is a Muslim cop, you could say it's a patriot, but it's actually fighting for within the community as opposed to trying to clear the name of the community. I think creating characters that happen to be Muslim, so in a softer way, reframing inclusion in that way, because what you talk about Weird Lady Parts, you talk about sort of, these shows did not originate in the US. One originated in England, one originated in Canada, and then when it was successful, it was picked up by the US. And it is not a coincidence that I feel that the Muslim representation that comes out of the US is very, either it's like a very certain sort of a comedy, or it's like, you know, Miss Marvel was a superhero created by a Muslim woman who was in the edit years ago for 20 years, and then they were able to establish a following. There was something systematically happening in terms of a performative representation of Muslims, I feel, in our media in the US. So there is a question about US and beyond US. The reason that nuanced stories representing Muslims are coming out internationally first is not a coincidence. Because policies, because diversity of immigration, because when you grow up in like places, not that like there's not anti-Muslim sentiment in the UK or anti-brown sentiment, whatever you want to call it, but there are now generations of people that mingle, take trains together, do this, you know, their friend is called Mo, whatever, like that is how these things happen. So we are still living in bubbles, right? How do we talk to the other side? How do we talk to the other aisle? You know, these are, anyway, long-winded answer or comment.
In terms of how we reframe inclusive media representation, I agree with Malik. Money talks, and Crazy Rich Asians, Black Panther, that was a turning point for those communities. And so I think, yeah, money definitely matters. And then many of the things that you said, Iram, about having someone from start to finish on a project. You don't call in a Muslim consultant at the end. You have someone actually on your team for the whole process is very important. I co-authored a test with Sue Obeidi of the Muslim Public Affairs Council called the Obeidi Alsultany test that's supposed to help Hollywood improve representations of Muslims. And it was inspired by other tests like the Bechtel test, which is for women. And for those who are not familiar with the test, I feel like it speaks volumes. It basically says that the test is you have two women who are talking to each other about something other than a man. So it just highlights the kinds of representations of women for so long in Hollywood. It's such a low, people criticize it's such a low bar, but it highlights what it's been like. Our test, there's a RIS test out of the UK that highlights the oppressed Muslim women and the terrorists. Our test is really about, we see you diversifying Hollywood, but we see you're making a lot of mistakes. And so some of the suggestions include things like having someone on your staff from start to finish and not adding the consultant at the end. Diversifying who Muslims are, that they don't all have to be Arab. You know, we want to see the diversity of Muslims in the world. Another criterion is to do new stories. There's a tendency to let's go back and redo Aladdin. Let's go back and redo Sinbad. Let's go back and redo, and we're going to diversify. And okay, but there are also so many new stories, and we need to hear those stories.
And Evelyn, I'm so interested to know, like, what is the reaction, or like when you're dealing with, you know, Hollywood and advice and doing that, like, do you feel like it's sinking in or getting through? Do you feel like there's pushback, or is it just sort of like, oh yeah, that's great, and then like check the box?
I think there is a range in my experience, where some want to get it right. Some are worried about criticism. So a lot of it is being driven by cancel culture and fear of getting it wrong. A lot of it is damage control. So also at the very end, and I know there are people out there who are consultants who might be part of the process, but a lot of my experience has been at the very end, damage control, or when it's too late to change anything, just to get a sense of how are Muslims going to react? Are they going to cancel their membership? But I have had some experiences, and this is the type of consulting I like doing is more educational. Like at the beginning of a project, this is how ancient Egypt has been portrayed. This is how Muslims have been portrayed. You know, since I am an educator, those are the kinds of consulting jobs that I prefer, where I feel like there is an openness to learning early on in the project rather than the damage control at the very end.
Right. Rather than trying to Frankenstein it together at the end of like, let's put this arm where the head's supposed to be. And yes, we see a lot of those. I wanted to ask you, and it's okay if you all can't think of anything off the top of your head, what is a piece of, can be a film, television, a play, even a documentary, and kind of media where you think they like really got it right? Where it's like a shining example for people who are out there listening right now, like, this is a great example of, you know, doing this right, or capturing a very authentic story.
There was this Canadian show about like 10 years ago called Little Mosque on the Prairie. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yeah.
It's just a sweet show about like a little Muslim community in Canada. And because like most of the characters are Muslim, there is a diversity of the Muslim identity where everybody's different, even though they're all Muslim. And I think by having something in this kind of environment, we really understand how different this, like our monolith representation can actually be, where people have unique identities within this community.
I love Little Mosque on the Prairie, and that is a Canadian show that didn't make it to the US. I think because during that time, the US wasn't doing that, but now it's like, yeah, we'll buy that show and bring it in, and you know, we'll take the credit for it. For me, it's We Are Lady Parts. When I saw that, I cried out of joy the whole time. I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
I will second that, and I'll also throw in Sort of, which is also very authentic.
Okay.
Not a show in the traditional sense, but I watched, I think it's The King's Jester, Hassan Minaj's last stand-up. And as much as I love Mo and Rami, that speaks to like a very specific point in time, you know, figuring life out. Whereas if you saw the stand-up, he referenced 9/11 at the beginning, talking about his childhood, but then the whole arc of his story that night was really about, I'm a father now and I have a wife now who I have to answer to, and I'm speaking from personal bias in a way, but it speaks to like a different part of being a Muslim that I thought we haven't gotten to yet. It's like, and I like to write about it, like I'm a family man, so it's like a different aspect that obviously all of us come from families, and I haven't felt like we've seen that a lot. Definitely haven't seen it in a show yet, but that stand-up spoke to me more so than some of the other ones. And I love the figuring stuff out shows too that Rami Mo do, but that really spoke to me in a different way, because I was surprised, to be honest, that, oh, this is really about a man trying to do right by his kids and his wife. So.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Did we go through everybody? We did, right? Okay. I know when I saw We Are Lady Parts, I'm like, did I just make this up in my head? Am I actually really seeing this? That was so exciting. And there's just moments like in Mo where, you know, the siblings are all, you know, praying over their father's grave, where I was just like, when have I ever, I'm going to cry thinking about that. When have I ever seen that on television? Miss Marvel inside the mosque, the Islamic Center with Mahershala Ali and Rami. There's moments where if I could glue them all together, that's perfect to me. Well, nothing's ever perfect because I got to complain and pick shit apart. But anyway, okay, I'm going to just look at some questions that we have here. And I'm going to put on my glasses that are going to reflect back at you. Sorry. Okay. Here is a question from Larnell. Will there be more Muslims portrayed in animated and family movies of different types? It's a good question.
What comes to my mind is Mira the Royal Detective, which I love. It's a Disney show for, I don't know how old, 3 to 5-year-olds, but
Yeah.
It's about a little girl who's a detective, and she has Muslim friends in her community, and it's really
But it's done.
song.
Dr. Alsultany, it's done.
Yes, it's done. I've seen it, the Ramadan song.
No, it's
Oh,
done.
oh!
Like, it's done.
I didn't
not
know
coming back.
that. I didn't know that.
So they're done.
Yeah. I don't know about others that are coming, but what I'm observing in terms of what Disney does right now is they remake everything and make it diverse. So we're going to remake Cinderella with a Black princess. We're going to remake it, so I think it's part of the vision right now of remaking all of the cartoons with a more diverse cast. So we might see more Muslims portrayed in animated and family movies, but the one that came to mind was Mira, and that's very sad that it's over.
And this question is for you, Evelyn, from Catherine. Does your research take into account film and cinema representations beyond the United States film industry?
Unfortunately, it does not. I am very focused on representations in the US and those that the US purchases, like We Are Lady Parts and sort of that become part of the US media landscape. I'm very curious about other countries, but it's not my focus of research.
I thought that was interesting, though. I think, Iram, it's a point that you brought up that a lot of this stuff, well, I think a few of you did, is coming from, the UK or Canada. And it's just it's really interesting that that's where it originates.
You know what else came from Canada? Transplant, which was about a Syrian refugee doctor. It was a Canadian TV drama, and then NBC, I think, brought it.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because that means a lot of the more diverse representations of Muslims in the US are by way of Canada and the UK.
But
go ahead.
I was just going to say, a friend of mine, also fantastic writer, director, Fawzia Mirza, who's Canadian, she said this, and I completely agree with her, that it has to do also with funding of the arts. We can say that, we need to have our, Muslim kids be in the arts, but there's such a dearth of funding of the arts. A lot of these shows were sort of financed through these like long development labs, right? So there is such it's not a level playing field for a lot of people, and especially I think people of color, and you could argue maybe like financially Muslims in the US are, I don't know what the stats are, I'm not going to go there, but like it feels that a lot of these shows were years and years of development just by sort of labs and funds and that. And in the US, if we look at the pipeline of diversity into the studios and TV and film, those are also, I feel like, very, very specific and very thin sort of access points. They're not nuanced and wide and deep into society, reaching into these diverse pockets that can then trickle up into the studio system or the TV system. So that is also another place to maybe reframe inclusion, is to create sort of more grants, which I know that Riz's company and a lot of like Pillars Fund people are doing that. But that's another way, I think, to kind of highlight these voices.
And I agree, those fellowships are very important.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you brought up funding because, yeah, it just doesn't just like magically happen. Somebody who is anonymous attendee asked, in lieu of Hollywood's depiction of Malcolm X converting to Islam and his beliefs being the basis for community activism, how significant was this cinematic representation in your opinion? And I guess referring to the film.
Well, nobody at the time, I don't remember anybody doing it other than maybe Roots maybe had like a one little moment where somebody played Malcolm X, and it was very slight. I mean, that might be me just projecting onto like the sequel of Roots. And now there's a few more, but I think to answer the question, I say it was significant, even more, speaking as a Black Muslim and talking to other Black Muslims about it, especially those who went to the big screen. I remember, I was telling my wife this, I remember specifically, and don't ask me how old I was. I was a kid, but we skipped school when that movie came out because it's like, okay, first, we were 17, so it's like, all right, we don't want to be in school anyway. But even beyond that, it's like, okay, look, this is like Malcolm X, this is history. Even before the movie came out, this is history, and it just meant so much to us that, like, dude, we've all read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Still, by the way, my favorite book, I would suggest, as with a lot of things, the book will give you so much more than the movie. The movie's 3 hours, the book gives you the entire life. But in terms of showing his conversion, I think it was just, because this is, to be frank, people watch a lot more movies than read books. I'm a reader, but a lot of the people who skipped school that day were not readers. I was like the one who read, but everybody goes to the movies. Everybody watches TV shows. So in that sense, I think it was hugely important.
I agree that it was very important, especially in thinking about this history of stereotyping and misrepresentation. And then you have a few exceptions along the way. And this is Spike Lee, so he's not like the man in Hollywood. He's an independent filmmaker who's, all of his early films just made such an impact in terms of representation and alternative stories. So when Malcolm X came out, it circulated like a Hollywood movie, even though it was made by an independent filmmaker. And the representation of Islam in that film is really important and stands out from the rest.
I think Malcolm X was probably my earliest Muslim American hero, and like someone who makes you be proud to be Muslim. And I think up until probably very recently, there haven't been people like that where you're like proud to reference them as a Muslim American, that are in the like zeitgeist of the country.
Yeah. And somebody not growing up here, it obviously reached international shores as well, because definitely knew about the film before I'd seen it.
It's interesting because, I'm older. So growing up, for me, it was Muhammad Ali. It was like, we have the same last name. I know it sounds so basic, but back then that meant something. And, he spoke openly, whatever the politics now, and looking at that now, I know there's a lot of scrutiny around that, but to me, that was such a sense of pride. It's like, look who we have, like somebody's fighting for us. And that's what it felt like, so yeah, I think that was my first, I know I call him my first sort of American Muslim hero. I'm looking at another question here. This is for Malik. Do you see any strong connection between Malcolm X's activism and the post 9/11 demonization of Muslims in the US? Do you want me to reread that, or is that clear?
One more time. I think I got it. I'm just processing how to answer this. Read one more time, please.
Probably how I garbled it too. Do you see any strong connections between Malcolm X's activism and post 9/11 demonization of Muslims in the US? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, we thinking of how to keep this short.
We got time.
Yeah, no, I don't think we do for that one. But I will say that it, we love Malcolm X as Muslims. But even, granted, I'm probably in a bubble. I don't hear it as much as I used to, but I do remember a time when it was like, okay, Malcolm X, they hate white people. They, they don't want anything to do with, America, the separatists, the racists. So from that background, and again, I'm a Muslim, that's not what I believe, but I'm aware that going all the way back to the beginning, like who's telling the narrative of who we are, if people are hearing that, Malcolm X and the Muslims hate America, hate white people, then by extension, I can see a very straight line connection between all the Muslims blew up the Twin Towers, hate America, hate white people. So in that sense, anonymous, whoever has answered that question, I think you can make a very direct line between how I want to say it, the mainstream view of how Muslims get seen, and then, and conversely, and I don't know if this is the next question, but as a Muslim, the activism of saying, your view of who we are as Muslims is very limited. Don't use this one act, but we are so diverse. We have so many more stories. It's not just the terrorist thing, and really the terrorist thing is, like that. If you even say it. And see, I was trying to keep it short, so let me just close this by saying you can get me going on this one. I think in relation to the artists, because we're all artists, I think, and I'm only going to speak for myself, I don't speak for anybody else, but I saw the anti-Muslims, rhetoric pick up quite a bit after 9/11, and that made me say, okay, wait a minute, let me speak up and tell you more about my community. Let me show you the love of my community. Islam is peace, Islam is love. And so in that sense, maybe it's not the exact type of activism that Malcolm used, but my type of activism, yes. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who felt that way.
And, I remember I was at Newsweek, I was working at Newsweek during 9/11, and one of the covers we came out with was Why They Hate Us. And it was a kid, like an Afghani kid, holding a rifle. I felt sick. I felt sick that my name was in that magazine, not on that article, but much the same, I think my need to write about this and to start putting activism in my work was born out of crisis. And Evelyn, that sort of speaks to what we were talking about in the beginning about crisis. And is it a bad thing that's caused more of us to push ourselves out there and try and correct things or put different narratives out?
I agree. I think crisis generates opportunities. It gave us Rami, it gave us Ilhan Omar, it is generative. My critique of crisis is if we only do the work when there is a crisis, because the crisis just exposes what's already there. The crisis doesn't mean that, it's only here for now. It just exposes what's around us all the time that we might not see and experience. Well, some of us see and experience it all the time, but it makes it visible to other people. So I do think crisis provides opportunity, but I get concerned if that is our current approach to diversity, how far will it take us?
We have time for like one last quick question. Let's see if I can shrink this down. Representation of Muslims in journalism. Do you see the developments there as similar or different to those in culture and fiction? I do see more, like as we were just talking about, because there was more of a need to explain or to talk about, these various wars that we're in, these or whatever, the terrorist attack, whatever it is. I think, again, it was born out of crisis. And, I do think there's more representation in journalism, in the media, not enough, but we're getting there. There was like nobody when I started. So, and I always got the thing, you know, did you marry in? I'm like, what? No, this is my name. So, and if there's a time, is about music and culture. Okay, it's going to be too hard to shrink this down. I'm sorry, person that asked this question, I can't shrink it down, but I do want to talk about hip hop, but I can't because we don't have time. Any last thoughts from all of you? We have about 3 minutes. Anything you wanted to pop in here or say, and it can be anything about your hopes for how we're moving forward, where you think we need to go.
I guess my request for all of us, I mean, and this includes us as well, is to kind of reach across and be a little more uncomfortable and make ourselves aware of people we don't know, whether it's through their content or through just crossing the street and saying hi, because I think it does start from the streets. It doesn't end on the screens. It doesn't end on the voting booths. It does not end in graveyards. This is just, I mean, and we have to be united because now we're facing other crises, which whether it comes to pandemics or climate or whatever, we absolutely need to be united to survive. So I think it is high time that we start seeing ourselves in each other, whether it's watching content that shows the quote unquote other. So yeah, I will just say if it is an act of speaking, watching, introducing, just every day, every week, be conscious and try and reach out. Get to know things that you're not comfortable with.
This is why I'm so glad that we are all doing this right now, because we have different viewpoints. We're coming from different mediums, different angles. And I think it's moments like these that make me super excited about where we're going, where we can go, and that I'm just going to sound super corny, but that we all are pushing something out there that could very much move the needle and change the narrative. So I want to thank you all for being on this panel, and I've learned a lot, and I hope that we, are able to work together as a superhero team in the future. You guys are like, okay, that's enough, Lorraine. But anyway, thank you so much. And I'm going to throw this back to Marcia. But you guys have been fantastic, and this has been a great conversation.
Thank you.
I echo that. I really thank you all for your candor, for thinking out loud, and for your work, all of you, for all of your work. I think we all, everybody needs to be more open about understanding people. And hopefully this conversation will have made a few steps forward, baby steps perhaps towards that. I wanted to let everybody in the audience know that this has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So we hope you'll share that link. Again, the book is Broken, The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion. There's so much there. Here it is. There's so much to glean from it. But mostly just my heartfelt thanks to all of you for this really, really wonderful, thought-provoking conversation. I hope you all have a good night. And I hope that you all come back to see for future programs at the Center for Brooklyn History. Good night, all.
Thank you so much.